Right now, as you lie there, something is humming quietly through the small bones behind your ears. Even if the room around you is silent, your own breath moves across your throat. Your jaw, resting against the pillow, carries the faintest tremor of blood pulsing nearby. And if you were to whisper even a single word into the darkness, you would feel it before you heard it. A small buzz traveling up through your skull, through the dense curved bones of your jaw, through the soft tissue of your neck, arriving at your inner ear from the inside, a fraction of a second before the sound of your own whisper even reached the air around you. This is happening constantly, every time you speak, every day of your life, and you have almost certainly never noticed it, because it has never once been any different. It is simply what your voice has always sounded like to you, from the inside. There is a strange kind of intimacy in this. You have never actually heard your own voice the way anyone else hears it. Not once. Not when you were small and just learning to shape sounds with your mouth. Not in your teenage years, when your voice may have dropped or shifted or cracked in unpredictable ways. Not yesterday, not 5 minutes ago. Every single person who has ever spoken to you has heard something slightly different from what you hear when you speak. And for most of human history, this simply didn't matter. There was no way to check. There was no way to compare. You spoke. Sound left your mouth. It traveled through the air to other ears, and that was that. The version only you could hear, humming up through your own bones, was the only version you ever needed, because nobody expected you to recognize yourself from the outside. Then, sometime in the late 19th century, that quiet arrangement began to change. Thomas Edison built a machine with a spinning cylinder wrapped in tinfoil, and when he spoke into it and played it back, the story goes that he was startled, maybe even unsettled, by what emerged. A voice. His voice, apparently, and yet not quite. Thin, strange, tinny, coming from a machine rather than a chest. It was one of the first times in the history of the species that a human being could hear their own voice, completely divorced from the felt experience of speaking. No jaw vibration. No warm hum traveling up through the skull. Just sound, floating free in the air, the way it always sounded to everyone else, and now, for the first time, audible to the speaker too. This should have been a small technical curiosity. Instead, it touched something oddly personal. People who heard early recordings of themselves, in the decades that followed, often described a peculiar unease, a sense that the voice belonged to them and also didn't, that it was recognizable and foreign at the same time, like catching a glimpse of your own face reflected at an unfamiliar angle, in a window rather than a mirror, where the light falls differently and the features seem subtly rearranged. Not wrong exactly, just not quite what you expected. That feeling never really went away. It just became more common, more ordinary, more built into daily life, as recording technology moved from tinfoil cylinders to wax discs, to magnetic tape, to digital files that anyone could make with a device in their pocket. And still, somewhere in nearly every person who has ever heard a recording of their own voice for the first time, there is a small flicker of surprise, a little internal double take. That's what I sound like? Something in the tone, or the pitch, or the texture of the sound doesn't match the internal expectation, the one built from a lifetime of hearing yourself only from the inside. It is worth sitting with this feeling for a moment tonight, gently, without any urgency to solve it,
because it points to something genuinely strange about the nature of self-perception. You know your own face extremely well. You have seen it in mirrors thousands of times, in photographs, in the reflections of shop windows and darkened phone screens and still water. Your visual sense of yourself, whatever its quirks, has had enormous amounts of practice catching up to reality. But your voice is different. Your voice as you know it was built almost entirely from the inside, through channels no one else has access to. And it was built that way for years, decades even, before recording technology gave you any real chance to check it against the outside version. Think about how sound actually travels, for a moment, in the calm and unhurried way you might think about anything late at night, when there is nowhere else to be. When another person speaks near you, the sound of their voice moves through the air as a wave, a ripple of compressed and rarefied air molecules, spreading outward from their mouth the way ripples spread outward from a stone dropped into still water. This traveling wave reaches your outer ear, is funneled down your ear canal, and sets your eardrum trembling. That tiny vibration passes through 3 impossibly small bones so small that all 3 of them together could fit on a fingertip, and eventually reaches the fluid-filled spiral of your inner ear, where it becomes the signal your brain interprets as sound. This is airborne conduction, and it is essentially the only way you ever hear anyone else's voice. But when you speak, something additional happens, something that only occurs for your own voice, and almost never for anyone else's. As your vocal cords vibrate, and as your throat and mouth and sinuses shape that vibration into words, some of that vibrational energy doesn't just leave your mouth as airborne sound. It also travels directly through the solid structures of your own head, through your jawbone, through your skull, through the soft tissue and fluid packed close against your inner ear. This is called bone conduction, and it reaches your inner ear by an entirely different route than airborne sound does, a shortcut through solid material, rather than a long trip through open air. And here is the detail that explains so much of the strangeness. Bone conducts low frequencies more efficiently than air does. Dense, solid material like the bones of your skull tends to carry deeper, lower vibrations especially well, the way a low rumble travels more easily through a wooden floor than a high, thin whistle does. So when that bone-conducted sound reaches your inner ear, mixing together with the airborne sound arriving through your ear canal at nearly the same moment, the combination is weighted more heavily toward the lower end of the frequency range than the sound reaching anyone else's ears would be. Your own voice, heard from the inside, gets a kind of built-in bass boost, a richness and depth added by your own skeleton that nobody standing across the room from you ever receives. This is why, for nearly everyone, a first recording sounds thinner, higher, sometimes almost unfamiliar in its lightness, compared to the voice they know from the inside. It isn't that the recording is wrong. In fact, in an important sense, the recording is more accurate than your own internal experience has ever been, because it captures only the airborne sound, the version that actually reaches every other person you have ever spoken to. The recording is not distorting your voice. Your own skull has been quietly, harmlessly, distorting it for you, every day, for your entire life, adding a warmth and depth that only you have ever gotten to hear. There is something almost tender about this idea, if you let yourself sit with it in the dark. Somewhere behind your jaw, and beneath your temples, layered onto the actual sound your voice makes in the world, has always been a private, slightly deeper, slightly richer version, heard by no one but you. A sound both real and unshareable. The recording doesn't lie to you. It simply lets you overhear, for the first time, the plainer, thinner truth that everyone else has always known. And so the strange discomfort so many people feel on hearing their own recorded voice for the first time isn't really about the recording being flawed at all. It's about two different sound paths, bone and air, disagreeing quietly with each other for years, without either of them ever being wrong, simply because they were never given the chance to be compared. Tonight, as you rest here, that same disagreement is humming along exactly as it always has, present in every breath, every small murmur, every sound your body makes even in stillness, and there is nothing to do about it, and nothing that needs doing. It is simply one of the small, unremarked ways that hearing yourself has always been a slightly different task than hearing anyone else. And it is only the first thread in a much longer, much gentler unraveling of why the voice on a recording can feel, all at once, so familiar and so foreign, a puzzle built not from anything broken, but from the ordinary architecture of bone and air and the quiet paths that sound has always taken to reach you.
Before we can really understand why a recorded voice feels strange, it helps to slow all the way down and ask a much simpler question. What is sound, actually, before it becomes a voice at all, before it becomes music, before it becomes anything we'd bother naming? And the answer, when you sit with it, is quieter and stranger than most people expect. Sound is just air changing its mind over and over, very quickly, about how crowded it wants to be. Picture a still room, not silent necessarily, just still, the air resting evenly everywhere, no particular pressure, anywhere higher or lower than anywhere else. Now picture something moving through that air, a hand clapping, a string plucking, a vocal cord snapping shut and open again. That motion shoves the air molecules nearest to it, crowding them together for an instant, and crowded air, being air, immediately tries to spread back out, which shoves the next layer of molecules, which spreads out and shoves the next, and on, a chain of tiny crowdings and tiny releases, rippling outward in every direction, like a nudge passed hand to hand through a very long line of people, standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark. That ripple, that traveling pattern of slightly more air, then slightly less air, then slightly more again, is the entire physical reality of what we call sound. It is not a substance. It is not a thing that exists on its own. It is a pattern of pressure, moving, and your ear, when you really think about it, is a strange and rather elegant piece of biological machinery whose entire job is to notice this pattern. Deep inside, past the part you can see, past the narrow canal, sits the eardrum, a taut little membrane, no larger than a fingernail, and when that traveling wave of crowded and uncrowded air reaches it, the eardrum simply moves with it, bowing gently inward as the pressure rises, springing back as it falls. It doesn't know or care what caused the pressure change. It cannot tell the difference between a falling leaf, a cello, and your own voice. It only responds, faithfully, to the push and pull of the air touching it, thousands of times each second, translating pressure into motion, and motion, eventually, through a small relay of bones and fluid and hair cells too delicate to think about for too long, right before sleep, into the signal your brain finally receives as sound.
Now, if that were all there was to it, every sound in the world would feel more or less the same, just louder or softer, and that is obviously not true. A drum and a violin can play the exact same note, matched perfectly in pitch, and still sound nothing alike, and understanding why requires two more ideas, sitting quietly beside each other, that are easy to blur together, but are really quite different. The first is frequency. The second is amplitude, and it's worth taking them one at a time, slowly, because most of the confusion people carry about their own recorded voice traces back to conflating these two. Frequency is simply how often that crowding and uncrowding repeats itself every second. If the air near your vocal cords bunches up and releases 200 times in a single second, that repetition rate, 200 times per second, is the frequency, and your brain interprets a higher frequency as a higher pitch, a lower frequency as a lower pitch. This is why a small, taut object, like a child's vocal cords or a tightly stretched, short string, tends to vibrate quickly and sound high, while a large, loose object, like a grown man's vocal cords or a long, slack cello string, tends to vibrate more slowly and sound low. Nothing mystical here, just physical size and tension, translated directly into how many times per second the air gets nudged. Amplitude, meanwhile, has nothing to do with how often the air is disturbed, and everything to do with how much.
It's the size of the crowding, not the speed of it. A gentle whisper and a shout can share the exact same pitch, the exact same frequency, while differing enormously in amplitude, in how forcefully the air molecules are pushed together and pulled apart. Amplitude is what your brain hears as loudness. Think of frequency as how quickly someone is knocking on a door, and amplitude as how hard each knock lands. You can knock quickly and gently, or slowly and hard, or any combination between, and those two qualities, speed and force, rate and size, stay independent of one another the entire time. That independence is worth holding on to, quietly, because later it will matter for understanding why raising your recording volume can never fix the specific kind of unfamiliarity people feel about their own voice. Loudness was never the problem to begin with. If frequency and amplitude were the whole story, though, every instrument tuned to the same note, played at the same volume, would sound identical, and a piano and a human voice, both humming a middle note, would be indistinguishable. They are not, of course, and the reason takes us gently into a slightly more intricate idea, one that sound almost never travels alone. When a vocal cord vibrates, or a string is plucked, it rarely produces just one single, clean frequency. It produces a main frequency, called the fundamental, the one your ear locks onto as the note or pitch you're hearing, but layered quietly on top of that fundamental are a whole family of additional, fainter vibrations at frequencies that are neat mathematical multiples of the fundamental, twice as fast, 3 times as fast, 4 times as fast, and so on. These extra layers are called harmonics or overtones, and they are not separate sounds so much as the same source vibrating in several ways, all at once. The whole length of a string or column of air trembling together, while smaller sections of it also tremble independently, each contributing its own faint, higher note into the mix.
You cannot easily pick these harmonics out one by one, not without training or instruments, because your brain fuses them together automatically into a single, unified impression. But the particular blend of harmonics present, which ones are strong, which ones are faint, which ones are barely there at all, is precisely what gives a sound its character, its texture, the quality that lets you recognize a friend's voice on the phone after just one syllable, or tell a trumpet from a clarinet even when they're playing the identical note at the identical volume.
This quality has a name, borrowed from a French word meaning stamp or print, as if each voice presses its own particular seal into the air. It's called timbre, and it is, in a real sense, the fingerprint of a sound. The thing left over once pitch and loudness have both been accounted for, and something still remains to distinguish one voice from another. And there is one more piece worth laying gently alongside timbre before we let this rest, something called resonance, because timbre isn't only about which harmonics a vibrating source produces, it's also about which of those harmonics get amplified or dampened by the space the sound has to pass through on its way out. Think of pushing a child on a swing. Push at just the right rhythm, matching the swing's own natural back and forth timing, and even small pushes build into large, easy arcs. Push at the wrong rhythm, and your effort mostly fights itself, doing very little. Hollow spaces behave the same way with sound. They have their own natural rhythms, their own preferred frequencies, and any vibration passing through them gets nudged. Some frequencies reinforced and swelled, others quietly absorbed and thinned. The human throat, mouth, nasal passages, even the sinuses, all form irregular, ever-shifting hollow spaces, and as your vocal cords produce their busy stack of harmonics, that raw sound travels up through this particular architecture of your particular skull and comes out the other side reshaped, certain frequencies favored, others softened, before it ever reaches open air. A pure tone, the kind a laboratory tuning fork or a simple electronic tone generator produces, has almost none of this complexity. It carries one frequency, cleanly, without a crowd of harmonics riding along beneath it, without any resonant chamber shaping it on the way out, and so it sounds, to most ears, oddly flat, almost featureless, more like an idea of a sound than a real one. A human voice is the opposite of that in almost every way, a fundamental tone, thick with harmonics, all of it filtered and colored by the unrepeatable shape of one particular throat and mouth and skull, arriving in the world already dressed in resonance before a single word has even been spoken. Let's stay with that image for a moment. The voice already dressed in resonance before a single word is spoken, because it helps to slow down and actually follow the whole journey from the very beginning, from before there is any sound at all, back to the quiet place where a voice starts, which is not the throat, and not even close to the throat. It starts in the lungs, or more precisely, it starts with the simple, unglamorous act of moving air out of the lungs, something you have done many hundreds of thousands of times today without once thinking about it, and are doing again right now, slowly, as you listen to this. Air sits in the lungs at a certain pressure, and when the diaphragm relaxes and the rib cage settles, that air is gently pushed upward, out through the windpipe, and this moving column of air, on its own, is nearly silent. It's just breath. You can hear this for yourself, in a way, by simply exhaling with an open, relaxed throat. No words, no hum, nothing, just air passing through, and noticing how little sound that actually makes. Almost none. It's a whisper of friction against the sides of the airway. Nothing more, and this matters, because it means voice is not something breath does by itself. Breath is only the raw material, the fuel, the wind moving through the pipe. Something else has to happen to that moving air before it becomes a voice at all, and that something else happens at a surprisingly small, surprisingly delicate structure sitting right at the top of the windpipe, called the larynx, which most people know, if they know it by any name, as the voice box, though it's really more like a voice gate. Inside the larynx are the vocal folds, and it's worth pausing on that name for a second, vocal folds, rather than the older, more common phrase vocal cords, because cords suggest something like guitar strings, taut lines stretched between two fixed points, plucked or bowed to vibrate, and that image, though it's the one most people carry around, is not quite right. The vocal folds are not strings. They are two soft, moist folds of tissue and muscle, stretched horizontally across the airway like a pair of curtains, or perhaps more like a pair of lips turned sideways, and ordinarily, when you are simply breathing, these folds sit open, relaxed, letting air pass through freely and silently, the same quiet whisper of breath from a moment ago. But when you begin to speak, or sing, or even just hum quietly to yourself, muscles in the larynx pull those folds together, drawing them nearly closed, leaving only a narrow slit between them, and this is where the transformation happens, where breath stops being merely breath. Air pressure builds up beneath the folds, pushing against them from below, and once that pressure is strong enough, it forces its way through the narrow gap, and here is the elegant, slightly strange physics of it. The very act of air rushing through that narrow slit causes the pressure just above the folds to drop, in the same way that air rushing past an airplane wing lowers pressure and creates lift, and this drop in pressure pulls the folds back together again, snapping the gap shut for a fraction of an instant, before the building pressure below forces them open once more, and the whole tiny cycle repeats. Open, close, open, close. Not once or twice, but somewhere between 100 and a few hundred times every single second. This fluttering, self-sustaining vibration is what actually creates the buzzing, complex source sound we talked about earlier, the raw material full of a fundamental frequency and all its stacked harmonics. And it happens so quickly, so many times each second, that no conscious part of your mind is steering it moment to moment. You do not think about opening and closing your vocal folds any more than you think about each individual heartbeat. You simply decide to speak, and the folds do the rest, cycling open and shut, turning a plain column of moving air into something with real acoustic texture, something with a pitch, something with a personality already beginning to take shape. It's a strange thing to sit with, actually, that the human voice, this thing so central to identity, so recognizable that a single word spoken in another room can tell you exactly who is in the house, begins as nothing more than a controlled flutter of wet tissue interrupting a stream of air, hundreds of times a second, mechanically, almost mundanely. There is nothing mystical happening at the level of the vocal folds themselves. It's closer to the way a reed vibrates in a clarinet, or the way a flag snaps and ripples in steady wind, physics doing what physics does, air and tissue negotiating a rhythm together. And yet from this small, repetitive, almost humble mechanical event, everything else follows. Because remember, this buzzing source sound, on its own, sitting right there at the larynx, is not yet a voice anyone would recognize, not yet even really speech. It still has to travel. From the larynx, that raw, vibrating column of air,
rises up through the throat, what anatomists sometimes call the pharynx, a flexible muscular tube that can narrow or widen, lengthen or shorten slightly, depending on how the head and neck are positioned, and this throat is the very first resonating chamber the sound passes through, the first hollow space with its own natural preferences, already starting the work of favoring certain harmonics and quietly letting others fall away. From there, the sound has two possible paths forward, and often takes both at once, blending them. One path leads up and forward into the mouth, the oral cavity, a space whose shape is remarkably unstable compared to something like the throat, because the mouth is constantly being reshaped, moment to moment, by the tongue, the lips, the jaw, the soft palate, all of it moving in a kind of continuous, fluid choreography as you speak. The tongue alone can be flattened or arched, pulled back or pushed forward, its tip raised behind the teeth or dropped low and relaxed, and each of these positions changes the shape and volume of the air inside the mouth, which changes which frequencies resonate and which get damped, in exactly the same swing-pushing sense described a moment ago. This is, in fact, largely how vowel sounds are made, not by changing the buzzing source at the vocal folds very much at all, but by reshaping this downstream resonant space around a mostly unchanged source sound. Say the vowel in the word see, then slowly shift toward the vowel in the word saw, without changing your pitch or your loudness, and you can feel the tongue and jaw quietly rearranging the shape of the resonating cavity, retuning it, the way you might slide a mute in and out of a trumpet's bell to change its color without touching the player's breath at all. The teeth, oddly enough, play their own small but genuine part here too, not as vibrating sound sources themselves, but as fixed obstacles the air and tongue interact with, shaping certain consonant sounds, the hiss of an S, the light touch of a TH, sounds that depend on air being forced through a narrow specific gap near the teeth, similar in spirit, though not in mechanism, to that narrow gap between the vocal folds themselves. Which is one small reason among several why the loss of teeth, or significant changes in their positioning, can subtly alter the texture of a person's speech, not because the voice box has changed at all, but because one of the filtering surfaces downstream has. The other path, running alongside the mouth, leads up into the nasal cavity, and here something interesting happens depending on a small flap of tissue called the soft palate, which can rise to seal off the nasal passage almost completely, directing sound and air only through the mouth, or lower, to allow some portion of that resonating sound to pass up into the nose as well, adding its own particular resonant coloring, its own set of frequencies favored or dampened by that space.
This is, quite literally, the difference between an oral sound and a nasal one. Try saying the word bad, then slowly shift toward the word mad, feeling how the soft palate seems to drop, opening that second pathway, letting a noticeably different resonant quality bloom in, a quality most people would immediately and correctly call nasal, without ever having thought consciously about where that word even comes from. So already, by the time a single word has fully left the body, the sound has been assembled by breath, buzzed into complexity at the vocal folds, and then filtered, in sequence, through the throat, the mouth, sometimes the nose, each space adding its own resonant signature, each shape unique to that particular speaker, all before the sound ever reaches open air, let alone a microphone, let alone anyone's ear. And it's in that gap, between the voice as it exists inside the body, and the voice as it finally arrives somewhere else, that the story is about to take an unexpected turn. Now that the sound has left the body, though, something curious is worth noticing, which is that the speaker themselves never actually hears it that way. Never quite that way, because a person listening to their own voice is not simply a listener in the ordinary sense, positioned at some polite distance, receiving sound waves the way anyone else in the room receives them. A speaker is, in a very real and physical sense, standing inside the instrument while it plays. And this turns out to matter more than it might seem, because it means the voice a person has heard every single day for their entire life arrives to them by two separate paths at once, not one, and those two paths do not agree with each other. The first path is the familiar one, the one that requires no special explanation because it's simply how hearing works in general. Sound leaves the mouth, travels through the air as a pressure wave, is gathered by the outer ear, funneled down the ear canal, and arrives at the eardrum, where it sets that small taut membrane vibrating. From there, those vibrations pass across three tiny bones in the middle ear, bones with old, almost domestic names: the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, a little chain of levers smaller than a grain of rice, working together to amplify the vibration and pass it along to the fluid-filled inner ear, where it's finally translated into the electrical signals the brain will interpret as sound. This is air conduction. It's the path by which a person hears traffic, music, birdsong, and also, this is the part worth sitting with, the path by which a person hears everyone else's voice, and their own voice too, once it has left their mouth and traveled, however briefly, through open air to reach their own ears from the outside. But there's a second path, and it doesn't involve air at all, not in that same sense. When the vocal folds vibrate, when the throat and mouth resonate, they aren't only pushing sound waves outward into the room, they're also, at the very same moment, setting the surrounding tissue into vibration. The bones of the skull, the jaw, the small bones of the middle ear themselves, even the fluid of the inner ear, all of this can be set moving directly, mechanically, by the vibrations happening so close by, without that sound ever needing to travel out through the air and back in through the ear canal at all. This is called bone conduction, sometimes bone and tissue conduction, to be more precise, since soft tissue plays a role too. And it means that a portion of what a speaker hears of their own voice is arriving not from outside, but from within, transmitted directly through the solid and semi-solid structures of the head itself. It's worth pausing on how strange this actually is, because most sound in a person's life behaves in a single, consistent way. It happens somewhere, it travels through air, it enters the ear. One path, one delivery system, entirely predictable. The voice is the one significant exception to this rule, the one sound a person produces that reaches their own hearing by two entirely different physical mechanisms simultaneously: air conduction and bone conduction, layered on top of each other, blended together so seamlessly, so automatically, from the very first sounds an infant makes, that the brain never bothers to separate them out. It simply treats the combined result as a single unified experience, the sound of one's own voice, without any awareness that it's actually a composite, a kind of internal duet between two very different physical processes. And this matters enormously for the specific question of why a recorded voice can sound so unfamiliar, because the two paths are not, in fact, equal contributors across all frequencies. If they were, if bone conduction simply added a proportional boost to every pitch a person's voice contained, the difference between the internal voice and the external one might be barely noticeable, just a bit of extra volume, extra richness spread evenly across the whole sound. But that isn't what happens. Bone conduction has a distinct bias, a specific way of favoring certain frequencies over others, and understanding why requires thinking, for a moment,
about the physical nature of bone itself. Bone is dense. It's rigid, relatively heavy for its size, and these are exactly the properties that make a material transmit low-frequency vibration efficiently while resisting the transmission of higher frequencies. This isn't unique to the human skull, incidentally. It's a general property of dense, stiff materials, and something like it can be felt in far more ordinary settings. Anyone who has ever pressed an ear to a wall to listen to music playing in another room has experienced a version of this. What comes through tends to be the bass, the low rumble of the drum, and the low end of a bass line, while the higher notes, the vocals, the cymbals, the fine detail of the melody, arrive muffled or vanish almost entirely. The wall, like bone, conducts low frequencies more readily than high ones. It acts, in effect, as a kind of natural filter, letting the heavy, slow-moving vibrations through, while damping the fast, delicate ones. The skull does something structurally similar. When a person speaks, the low-frequency components of their voice, the deep resonant hum underlying the sound, the fundamental pitch, and its lower harmonics, transmit through bone with relative ease, arriving at the inner ear directly, mechanically, almost instantly. The higher frequencies, meanwhile, the components that carry much of what makes speech sound bright, or clear, or sharp, those are transmitted through bone far less efficiently. They lose energy along the way. So by the time the two paths combine, air conduction carrying a full and balanced spectrum, bone conduction carrying a spectrum weighted heavily toward the low end, the resulting blend that a speaker perceives is not neutral, it's tilted. It's warmer, deeper, fuller than the voice actually is, fuller specifically in the low frequencies, because bone conduction is quite literally adding extra low-frequency information that no one else in the room is receiving at all. This is worth sitting with for a moment, in the particular, unhurried way that makes sense at this hour, because it means the richness so many people associate with their own voice, that felt sense of depth, of resonance, of gravity even, is partly an artifact of anatomy rather than a property of the sound itself. It isn't that the person's voice is secretly deeper than everyone realizes, and it isn't that recordings are somehow degrading or thinning the sound out through some flaw in the equipment, though equipment does have its own limitations, which is a separate matter for later. It's that the internal experience of one's own voice has never been purely acoustic in the first place. It has always been part acoustic and part mechanical, part sound wave, and part skull vibration, and the mechanical part has been quietly, faithfully, adding bass since the moment that person first made a sound as an infant, so consistently and for so long, that its contribution simply feels like the voice, indistinguishable, unnoticed, built into the very definition of what one's own voice is supposed to sound like. A recording, of course, can only capture the first path. A microphone has no skull to vibrate, no jawbone to resonate through, no fluid-filled inner ear sitting conveniently close to the source. It only receives what travels through air, the same signal that reaches everyone else's ears when that person speaks aloud to them, unfiltered by any internal bone conduction at all. Which means the recorded voice isn't actually wrong, isn't actually thinner, or tinnier, or lesser in some objective sense. It's simply, for the very first time, complete in a different way than the speaker is used to, because it's missing an entire channel of low-frequency information that has always, quietly, been there before, filling in warmth the speaker never had to ask for, and never noticed arriving. And once this piece is in place, Once it's clear that the mismatch begins with something as basic as which frequencies bone happens to transmit well, a further and slightly more delicate question starts to come into view about what exactly happens in that instant of comparison when the two versions meet, and why the mind reacts to the difference the way it so often does.
Before that question can be answered properly, it helps to slow down and look at what a microphone is actually doing, mechanically, in the moment sound reaches it, because most people go their whole lives using microphones without ever picturing what's happening inside that small metal grill, and the picture turns out to be gentler and more mechanical than most people expect, closer to a tiny drum than to anything electronic or clever. Inside nearly every microphone there is a diaphragm, a thin membrane, sometimes a fraction of the thickness of a human hair, suspended so that it can move freely when air pressure pushes against it. Sound, after all, is just a pattern of air pressure changing rapidly, waves of compression and rarefaction traveling outward from a source, in this case, a set of vocal folds vibrating and a mouth shaping the resulting hum into speech. When those pressure waves reach the microphone, they push and pull on that diaphragm, and the diaphragm moves in sympathy, faithfully, tracing the shape of the pressure changes the way a leaf traces the shape of a breeze. This is the first and most basic transformation happening in a recording, and it is worth resting on for a moment, because everything else in this section builds on top of it. The diaphragm does not know what a voice is. It does not know it is capturing something meaningful. It simply moves back and forth in response to physical pressure, a purely mechanical event, no different in principle from a window pane rattling slightly when a truck passes on the street outside. What happens next depends on what kind of microphone is doing the listening, but in most common designs, that mechanical motion of the diaphragm gets converted into an electrical signal, a process called transduction, which is really just a fancy word for changing one form of energy into another. In a dynamic microphone, the diaphragm is attached to a small coil of wire sitting inside a magnetic field, and as the diaphragm moves, the coil moves with it, and that motion through the magnetic field generates a tiny electrical current, rising and falling in step with the diaphragm's motion. In a condenser microphone, the diaphragm instead sits close to a fixed metal plate, forming something like a small capacitor, and as the diaphragm moves closer to or farther from that plate, it changes the electrical charge between them, again producing a signal that mirrors the physical motion. Two different mechanisms, one shared outcome. Physical vibration becomes electrical fluctuation, a pattern of voltage that carries, encoded within it, the shape of the sound that caused it. It's a strange thing to sit with, honestly, that a voice, something so personal, so tied to identity and memory, and the particular way a single person forms their words, gets reduced at this stage to nothing more than a wiggling voltage, a signal with no more inherent meaning than the reading on a thermometer. And yet nothing about the voice is lost in this reduction, at least not yet, because the wiggling voltage, if handled carefully, can be pushed back out through a speaker later and turned into moving air again, more or less recreating the original pressure pattern, more or less returning it to something recognizably a voice. The strangeness is not that information is destroyed here. The strangeness is that so much can survive being translated into something so abstract. But even before any of that translation happens, before the diaphragm even begins to move, something else has already shaped what reaches it, and that something is the microphone's polar pattern, a term that describes how sensitive a microphone is to sound arriving from different directions. Some microphones are built to be roughly equally sensitive all around, picking up sound from the front, the sides, and the back in a fairly even sphere, useful for capturing a whole room at once. Others, and this includes most microphones used for spoken voice, are built with a cardioid pattern, so named because the sensitivity, if drawn out as a shape, resembles a rough heart, wide and open at the front, tapering to almost nothing at the back. A cardioid microphone listens eagerly to whatever is directly in front of it and mostly ignores whatever is behind it, which is why so much recording advice involves speaking directly into a microphone rather than past it, and why the exact same voice can sound noticeably different depending on whether the speaker is centered in front of the capsule or turned slightly to one side, favoring one ear over the microphone the way a person might unconsciously favor a friend in conversation while a second friend stands just off to the side. Distance matters here too, in ways that are easy to underestimate. Sound spreads outward from its source and loses energy as it travels, which means a voice captured 6 inches from a microphone and a voice captured 6 feet from the same microphone are, acoustically, not really the same event at all, even if the speaker feels they're saying the exact same words in the exact same way. Close in, the microphone hears mostly direct sound, the pressure wave traveling straight from mouth to diaphragm with very little else mixed in. Farther away, the microphone begins to hear something else as well, which is the room itself. Sound waves don't simply vanish when they pass a microphone that happens to be sitting nearby. They keep traveling, bouncing off walls, ceilings, floors, furniture, glass, fabric, every surface reflecting some portion of the sound back into the space, arriving at the microphone a little later and from a slightly different angle than the direct sound did. These reflections blend with the original signal, and the blend is what gives a recording its sense of space. The subtle difference between a voice that sounds like it was captured in a small carpeted room and one that sounds like it echoed faintly through a tiled bathroom or a large empty hall. None of this is happening to the voice on purpose. It is simply what air and architecture do together, quietly, in the background of every recording ever made, including the most polished ones, where great care has usually been taken to control it, rather than eliminate it entirely, since eliminating it entirely turns out to sound strange in its own way, unnervingly flat, almost as if the voice were floating in no space at all. There is another effect worth mentioning here, one that surprises people the first time they learn about it, called the proximity effect. When a sound source, like a mouth, gets very close to certain kinds of microphones, particularly those cardioid designs already mentioned, the bass frequencies in the recorded signal increase noticeably, disproportionately, simply as a result of that closeness. This is why radio announcers and podcasters are often taught to keep a consistent distance from the microphone, sometimes trained to lean back slightly on louder words and closer on softer ones, because leaning in too far makes the voice sound artificially rich and heavy in the low end, warm in a way that has nothing to do with the actual voice, and everything to do with the physics of near sound fields interacting with a directional diaphragm. It's a gentle irony, in a way, that this proximity effect can sometimes reintroduce a kind of warmth into a recording, a low-frequency fullness that starts to resemble, faintly, the bass a person is used to hearing through their own bones, even though the mechanism producing it is entirely different, entirely external, entirely a property of distance and diaphragm design, rather than skull conduction. Once a signal has made it this far, past the diaphragm, past transduction, past polar pattern and distance and room reflections, it still isn't finished being shaped, because every microphone also has its own frequency response,
meaning it doesn't treat all frequencies with perfect equality. A given microphone might be slightly more sensitive to certain mid-range frequencies, the ones where most human speech lives, and slightly less sensitive to very low or very high frequencies, and this unevenness, usually subtle, sometimes more pronounced, depending on the microphone's design and cost and age, adds its own quiet coloration to the voice, a kind of signature, the acoustic equivalent of a particular pair of glasses ever so slightly tinting everything seen through them. Expensive microphones are often prized, not because they are perfectly neutral, but because their particular unevenness happens to be pleasant, flattering, even, to the kinds of frequencies present in speech and music, while cheaper microphones may emphasize frequencies in less flattering ways, tinny in the high end or muddy in the low end, though muddy and tinny are, worth noting, relative and somewhat subjective descriptions rather than precise technical ones. And after the microphone has finished doing its work entirely, the signal often passes through still more processing before a listener ever hears it, compression that narrows the gap between the loudest and quietest moments of a voice, noise reduction that tries to strip away hums and hisses, and the faint sound of a refrigerator 2 rooms away, equalization that boosts or trims certain frequency ranges to make a voice sound clearer, or closer, or more pleasant. Each of these steps is its own small act of interpretation, a set of choices, sometimes made automatically by software, sometimes made deliberately by a person sitting at a mixing desk, about which parts of the sound to keep, which to soften, which to remove entirely. Which means that by the time a recorded voice reaches anyone's ears, it has already passed through diaphragm motion, and magnetic induction, and polar sensitivity, and room acoustics and frequency response, and digital processing, layer after layer, each one faithful in its own narrow way but none of them neutral, none of them a perfectly clear window onto the original sound, which raises a quiet and rather interesting question about what, if anything, a truly accurate recording of a voice would even mean.
Let's follow that thread a little further, gently, into what happens after all that shaping and processing, once the voice has become nothing more than a pattern of numbers sitting quietly in a file, waiting to become sound again. Because there is a whole second journey here, almost a mirror image of the first, and it deserves its own slow unfolding. When a voice is recorded digitally, what actually gets stored is not a smooth, continuous wave, the way it existed in the air or on the microphone's diaphragm, but a long series of individual snapshots, taken many thousands of times per second. This is called sampling, and it works a little like a flip book, those childhood toys where a sequence of still drawings, viewed quickly enough one after another, create the illusion of continuous motion. A common rate for voice and music recordings is 44,100 samples per second, a number that seems oddly specific until you learn it comes from a mathematical principle showing that to faithfully capture a sound wave, you need to sample it at least twice as often as its highest frequency component, and human hearing tops out, roughly, somewhere around 20,000 hertz, a little less for most adults, especially as the years go by. So 44,000 samples a second gives a bit of headroom above that, enough to catch everything a person could plausibly hear. Each of these samples, these tiny snapshots, also has to record how loud the sound is at that particular instant, and this is where something called bit depth comes in, a separate and equally quiet decision. Bit depth determines how many distinct levels of loudness a single sample can represent, and again, a common standard, 16 bits, allows for 65,536 possible levels, which sounds like a great many until you consider that a human voice moves through a wide and constantly shifting range of loudness, whispered syllables giving way to emphasized ones, breath sounds fading in and out, and all of that has to be sorted, moment by moment, into one of those levels. Higher bit depths, 24 bits for instance, offer far more levels still, and are often used during recording and editing, even if the final version a listener hears gets reduced back down, because more levels means less of what's called quantization error, a faint kind of rounding mistake that happens when a sound's true loudness falls between two available levels and has to be nudged to the nearest one. In well-designed systems, this rounding is so small, it registers, if at all, as an almost imperceptible layer of noise, easily lost beneath the voice itself. Once a voice exists as this long grid of samples and levels, it often needs to be compressed, not in the loudness sense from before, but in the sense of file size, and this is where codecs enter the picture, quietly, in the background of nearly every recording anyone listens to. A codec is a method for squeezing digital audio into a smaller file, without, ideally, losing much that a listener would notice, and different codecs make different bets about what can be safely thrown away. Some, called lossless, preserve every bit of information, simply packing it more efficiently, the way a suitcase might be packed cleverly, rather than having items left out entirely. Others, called lossy, actually discard information, based on models of human hearing that predict which sounds a listener probably won't miss, sounds masked by louder sounds nearby, frequencies at the very edges of audibility, tiny details judged expendable. A popular and long-lived example is the MP3 format, developed through the 1980s and released more widely in the early 1990s by a team working at the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, among them Karl-Heinz Brandenburg, who spent years testing early versions of the format by playing a single a cappella recording of the singer Suzanne Vega's song, Tom's Diner, over and over, listening for artifacts, adjusting, listening again, because a solo voice with no instruments to hide behind turns out to be one of the hardest things for a lossy codec to compress convincingly. If a codec can make an unaccompanied human voice sound natural, it can usually handle almost anything else with less difficulty. At low enough compression, or with weaker codecs, these discarded details can leave behind a kind of watery, slightly metallic quality to a voice, sometimes described, again informally, rather than technically, as artifacts, small ghostly traces of the compression process itself, a swirl, or a shimmer, where consonants used to be crisp. Under most everyday listening conditions, at typical settings, this goes unnoticed, but it's worth knowing it can be there, one more quiet layer, folded into the version of a voice a person eventually hears. From this compressed or uncompressed digital file, the sound has to be converted back into something physical, back into moving air, and that happens by way of a component called a digital-to-analog converter, which takes the long list of numbers and turns them back into a continuously varying electrical voltage, smoothing the stair-step samples into something closer to the original wave shape, using small filtering circuits that round off the sharp mathematical edges the sampling process left behind. That voltage then travels, often after further amplification, to a speaker or a headphone driver, and here the process mirrors, almost exactly in reverse, what happened inside the microphone at the very beginning. Instead of sound moving a diaphragm to create an electrical signal, now an electrical signal moves a diaphragm to create sound, pushing a small cone or membrane back and forth, compressing and rarefying the air in front of it, sending out pressure waves that eventually reach an eardrum and begin the whole business of hearing all over again. And just as microphones have their own particular unevenness, their own gentle tinting of the sound passing through them, so do speakers and headphones, each with a frequency response that isn't perfectly flat, each favoring certain ranges over others because of the physical realities of their design, the size and stiffness of the diaphragm,
The shape of the enclosure around it, whether it sits in an open ear cup or a sealed one, whether it's a tiny driver in an earbud or a large woofer in a floor-standing speaker. A pair of headphones that emphasizes the low end will make a voice sound warmer, fuller, perhaps a touch boomy. A speaker that rolls off gently in the high frequencies will make the same voice sound softer, less crisp. The sibilant edges of say and t sounds smoothed away almost without a listener noticing why.
Then there's the question of loudness itself, and how a listener chooses, or a device chooses on their behalf, to reproduce it, because a phone speaker played at maximum volume behaves very differently from a proper set of studio monitors played at a comfortable level, and differently again from a pair of cheap earbuds where the driver has to work near the edge of its capability just to be heard over background noise, sometimes distorting slightly in the process, adding a faint buzz or rasp that wasn't present anywhere earlier in the chain. Equalization can be applied again at this stage too, not only during the original recording, since many playback devices and apps include their own settings, bass boosts, vocal enhancers, presets meant to make music or speech more exciting or more intelligible, each one another small reshaping of the sound before it ever reaches the ear. So, by the time a person hears a recorded voice through a laptop speaker, or through wireless earbuds, or through a good pair of over-ear headphones, that voice has traveled an extraordinarily long and layered path, shaped first by the physical body producing it, then by the room it was spoken into, then by the microphone's particular sensitivities, then by whatever mixing and processing happened afterward, then compressed and reconstructed through sampling and codecs, then reshaped once more by the frequency response and quirks of whatever speaker or driver finally turns it back into air pressure, moving toward an eardrum. None of these steps is dishonest exactly, none of them sets out to distort the truth of a voice, but each one makes its own small, almost invisible decision about what that voice should sound like, and all of those decisions stack, quietly, one on top of another, long before the question of how a person's own body hears their own voice differently ever even enters the picture. With all of that technical shaping now sitting somewhere in the background, it's worth turning towards something less mechanical and more personal, because even a perfectly reproduced recording, one that captured every frequency with total fidelity, would still sound wrong to most people the first time they heard it. That wrongness isn't really about equipment anymore. It's about expectation and about how strange it feels when a prediction the brain has been quietly making for an entire lifetime suddenly fails. Every waking moment a person speaks, their brain is running a kind of forecast. It predicts, almost instantaneously, what the next fraction of a second of sound should feel like, based on the motor commands it just sent to the jaw, the tongue, the vocal folds, the soft palate. This isn't unique to speech. It happens with reaching for a cup, with walking down a familiar hallway in the dark, with any action the body performs often enough that the nervous system builds a working model of the consequences before they arrive. Speaking is one of the most repeated, most rehearsed physical acts a person ever performs, rehearsed tens of thousands of times a day across a lifetime, and so the predictive model around it becomes extremely fine-tuned, almost unnervingly precise. When someone talks, they're not simply listening to themselves the way they'd listen to another person. They're comparing incoming sound to an internal expectation, checking, moment by moment, whether what arrives at the ear matches what the brain already assumed it would hear. Most of the time it does, closely enough that the checking process fades into the background entirely, unnoticed, the way a person doesn't consciously register the pressure of their own feet against the floor while standing. But a recorded voice breaks that quiet agreement. It arrives without the bone conduction, without the internal resonance, without the particular timing the brain has practiced for decades, and the mismatch between prediction and reality registers, faintly but unmistakably, as something being off. There's a name researchers sometimes use for this kind of internal forecasting system, an efference copy, a term that sounds clinical but describes something almost intimate, a copy of the command sent to the muscles, held in reserve by the brain so it can predict and later compare the sensory result. It's part of why a person can't tickle themselves the same way someone else can tickle them. The nervous system already knows what's coming and dampens the sensation because there's no surprise left in it. Recorded playback removes that whole mechanism from the equation. There's no efference copy running to soften or anticipate the sound because the brain isn't currently producing that speech. It's just receiving it, cold, the way it would receive any unfamiliar voice. And an unfamiliar voice claiming to be one's own is a strange thing for a predictive system to process. Layered on top of this prediction mismatch is something simpler and perhaps even more universal, which is the plain fact of unfamiliarity itself. A person hears their own internally conducted voice constantly, every single day, but they hear the externally recorded version of it only rarely, in short bursts, usually under circumstances that already feel a little self-conscious. A voicemail greeting, a video call recording, a clip someone else has shared. There simply isn't enough repeated exposure to that external version for it to feel normal the way the internal version does. And familiarity, it turns out, has an enormous effect on how pleasant or unpleasant something sounds or looks. Psychologists have studied this under the name of the mere exposure effect, a fairly dry label for a fairly warm phenomenon. People tend to prefer things they've encountered more often, all else being equal, simply because repetition breeds comfort. It shows up in music, where a song that felt unremarkable on first listen can become a favorite after the fifth or sixth hearing. It shows up in faces, in the layout of a familiar kitchen, even in nonsense syllables shown repeatedly in laboratory experiments, where participants rated the ones they'd seen more often as more likable without being able to say why. A person's own speaking voice, the internally heard one, is possibly the single most repeated auditory experience of their entire life, encountered from birth onward, thousands upon thousands of hours of exposure. Against that towering baseline of familiarity, a recorded voice, heard perhaps a few dozen times across a whole lifetime, simply hasn't had the chance to earn the same comfort. It sounds foreign, not because it's wrong, but because it's statistically rare. There's also a related idea worth sitting with quietly for a moment, which is that faces experience something similar, though through a visual channel instead of an auditory one. Most people are far more used to seeing themselves in a mirror than in a photograph, and a mirror reverses left and right, producing a slightly different arrangement than what a camera captures. So a photograph can look subtly off to the person in it, not because the photograph lies, but because it doesn't match the flipped version the person has spent years growing familiar with. Recorded voice and photographed face
share this same underlying shape of discomfort. Both replace a heavily practiced, internally generated version of self-perception with a more objective, externally generated one, and the brain, used to the former, treats the latter with mild suspicion. Underneath both of these threads, the predictive mismatch and the unfamiliarity, sits something a little deeper, which has to do with how tightly identity and self-recognition are bound up with sound and appearance in the first place. A voice isn't experienced as just another auditory signal, the way a passing car or a closing door might be. It's tied, from very early in life, to a sense of self, to the felt experience of being a particular person, located in a particular body, speaking in a particular way. Infants begin to recognize the acoustic signature of their own crying and vocalizing extremely early, and by early childhood, the voice has become deeply entangled with identity, name, personality, the sense of being oneself and no one else. So when a recording surfaces a version of that voice that sounds different, even mildly different, the brain isn't just processing a technical discrepancy in frequency response, it's processing a small challenge to something it holds as fundamentally, almost sacredly, consistent. This is part of why the reaction to hearing a recorded voice can feel disproportionate to the actual acoustic difference involved. Objectively, the difference between internally heard and externally recorded speech, measured purely in terms of frequency content, might be no more dramatic than the difference between two ordinary voices belonging to two different people. But the emotional charge attached to it is much higher because one of those voices is supposed to be uniquely, unambiguously, the listener's own. Any wobble in that certainty, however small, tends to register with more weight than a similar wobble would if it belonged to someone else's voice instead.
People rarely react with sharp discomfort upon hearing a stranger's recorded voice for the first time, because there's no internal prediction to violate, no decades of self-identification bound up in it. The distinctive unease belongs almost entirely to hearing oneself. It's worth noting, too, that this sensitivity to one's own identity markers isn't limited to voice. People often report a similar jolt on seeing old home videos of themselves, a mixture of recognition and estrangement, the uncanny sense of watching someone who is clearly them and yet doesn't quite move or sound the way memory insists they should. Some researchers who study self-recognition suggest that the brain maintains an unusually tightly defended model of what counts as self, more rigid and more emotionally guarded than its models of almost anything else in the world, precisely because so much depends on that model staying stable. Small deviations from it, even accurate ones, even ones capturing exactly what a microphone or camera actually recorded, can feel like minor threats to that stability, easily dismissed in daylight, but capable of lingering as a faint unease. None of this means the recorded voice is somehow less real or less true than the internally heard one. If anything, it's the version everyone else has always been hearing, the one that exists in the shared acoustic world rather than filtered privately through bone and cartilage. But understanding why it feels alien on first encounter, prediction failing quietly, familiarity running thin, identity briefly unsettled, can soften some of that first flinch of embarrassment into something closer to simple curiosity. And once that particular discomfort is set aside, it becomes easier to look more closely at what actually happens biologically in the moment someone listens back to their own recorded voice for the very first time. Let's turn now to a question that sits quietly behind everything covered so far, which is what other people are actually hearing when they listen to a voice in conversation, and how that compares to what a recording captures. It's tempting to assume that other listeners hear some pure, unfiltered version of a voice, the real sound, untouched, and that a recording either matches that reality or fails to. But that assumption doesn't hold up very well once it's examined slowly, because there is no single, uncontaminated version of anyone's voice floating in the air waiting to be perceived correctly. Every listener, in every room, hears something slightly different, shaped by forces that have nothing to do with the speaker at all. Consider two people standing in the same room, listening to the same person speak. They are not having identical auditory experiences, even though it might seem that way. One listener might be standing closer to a hard wall, catching more reflected sound, more of the room's particular signature layered over the voice. The other might be nearer a window or a soft couch, hearing something with less reverberation, a touch drier, a touch more direct. Their two ears are positioned differently in space, picking up slightly different timing and intensity cues, which their two brains will use to build two slightly different mental impressions of loudness, direction, and tone. Neither person is hearing the voice wrong. They are simply each hearing it from where they happen to be standing, filtered through their own particular ears, which have their own particular shape, their own particular sensitivity across the frequency range, quietly unique to each listener, the way fingerprints are unique, though far less commented upon. Now add a microphone into that same room. A microphone doesn't hear the way a human ear hears. It has no outer ear shaped like a small satellite dish to funnel and color sound before it arrives at the eardrum. It has no two ears spaced apart to help a brain calculate direction and distance the way human hearing does automatically, instinctively, from infancy. A single microphone captures air pressure changes at one point in space, converts them into an electrical signal, and that signal is what eventually becomes the recording. Depending on the type of microphone, its distance from the speaker, its angle, and the acoustic properties of the room it's placed in, that captured signal can differ quite noticeably from what any human listener standing nearby would have perceived. A cheap microphone, sitting too close to someone's mouth, might pick up a boominess in the low frequencies that no listener across the room would ever notice, an effect related to proximity that engineers have long been familiar with, sometimes called the proximity effect, where certain microphones exaggerate bass response as the sound source gets closer. A microphone placed too far away might drown a voice in room reflections, capturing more echo and less direct clarity than an attentive listener standing nearer would experience. So already, before any question of self-perception enters the picture, there are at least three different versions of a single spoken sentence. There is what listener 1 heard, filtered through their ears, their position, their particular neural processing. There is what listener 2 heard, filtered through a slightly different set of those same variables. And there is what the microphone captured, filtered through none of those biological processes, but through its own mechanical and electronic characteristics instead. None of these three versions is the single correct one. None of them is simply wrong. They are three different samples of an event that, physically speaking, radiated outward from a person's mouth in a complex three-dimensional pattern, interacting with a room and being intercepted differently
depending on what kind of receiver happened to be standing, or sitting, or mounted at each particular point in space.
This is a useful thing to sit with for a moment, because it quietly dismantles the notion that there's a single objective truth about how someone sounds, a truth that a good recording would reveal and a bad recording would distort. Sound doesn't work that way. It's inherently perspectival, meaning it depends on where you are standing and what kind of ears or microphone you're standing there with. A large concert hall makes this obvious at a larger scale. Acousticians have long known that a seat in the third row sounds meaningfully different from a seat under the balcony overhang, not because the orchestra plays differently for different sections of the audience, but because the sound arrives at those two locations having traveled different paths, bounced off different surfaces, arrived with different timing and different frequency emphasis. Nobody assumes the third row is hearing the real orchestra, while the balcony is hearing a distorted one. They're simply hearing it from different vantage points, and both vantage points are legitimate. The same logic extends to voice recordings, though it's less commonly framed this way. A recording captures a particular vantage point, shaped by the specific microphone used, its placement, the room's particular reflective and absorptive surfaces, perhaps some electronic processing applied afterward during editing, whether gentle or aggressive. It is not simply a mirror held up to some singular acoustic reality. It is one more sample, taken under specific technical conditions, of the same complex sound field that different human listeners are also sampling from their own respective positions. What makes it useful, and also occasionally what makes it strange to encounter, is that it's a sample without the accompanying bone conduction that the speaker's own body constantly supplies. It removes that particular internal ingredient entirely, leaving only what would have reached an outside ear, or something reasonably close to that, depending on the equipment. And there's a further wrinkle worth including here, because listening itself is not a passive, mechanical act of simply registering sound waves as they arrive. Human hearing is deeply shaped by attention, by expectation, by what the brain has learned to predict and prioritize. Two people in the same room, hearing what is technically the same acoustic signal, might come away with quite different impressions of a voice, depending on what they were focused on, what mood they were in, what associations that particular voice happened to trigger for them personally. A parent, listening to their child speak, carries years of accumulated familiarity that colors the perception in ways a stranger's brain simply cannot replicate on first hearing. Someone half distracted by their phone will process a voice differently, less completely, than someone giving their full attention. None of this shows up as a difference in the physical sound wave itself. It shows up entirely inside the listener's own nervous system, in how thoroughly that sound gets analyzed, categorized, remembered. This means that even the idea of asking, simply, "How do other people hear my voice?" doesn't have one tidy answer waiting to be discovered. Different people hear it differently, not just because of where their ears happen to be positioned in a room, but because their brains are doing different work with the same raw acoustic input, weighting different frequencies as significant, noticing or ignoring different qualities depending on their own listening history and their own reasons for paying attention in that moment. A singing teacher, listening to a student's voice, is doing something quite different, neurologically, from a friend simply enjoying a conversation over coffee, even if both are technically hearing the same physical sound. Given all this, a recording occupies an interesting middle position.
It isn't the internally heard voice, with all its bone-conducted low-frequency richness, and it isn't quite identical to what any particular external listener experienced in the room either, because it was shaped by its own specific technical chain, rather than by a living pair of ears and a living, attention-laden brain.
But it's also not simply a distortion layered on top of some purer original, because there was no single purer original to distort in the first place. It's closer to being one more valid sample among many possible samples, taken from a particular position through a particular instrument, preserving some features faithfully while inevitably failing to preserve others, the way any single photograph preserves a scene from one angle in one kind of light, while leaving out everything happening just outside its frame. Understanding this doesn't make the strangeness of hearing a recorded voice disappear entirely, since the internal experience of bone-conducted sound will always differ from what any microphone captures, no matter how good that microphone happens to be. But it does help relocate the discomfort somewhere more accurate. The recording isn't lying, and it isn't specially unflattering compared to some idealized true voice that exists only in imagination. It's simply one more angle on a sound that was always, even in the moment of its first utterance, something experienced differently by everyone in earshot. From here, it becomes worth turning to what happens technically inside the recording chain itself, from the microphone's diaphragm to the eventual playback, since that chain has its own quiet influence on what survives and what gets subtly reshaped along the way. There's a particular kind of person, though, for whom the recorded voice stops being an occasional, startling encounter and becomes instead a daily working material, something handled and shaped and listened to so often that the strangeness wears away almost entirely. Singers, actors, broadcasters, voice coaches, the engineers who sit behind the glass, adjusting faders while someone performs on the other side of it. For all of these people, the gap between the voice heard from inside the skull and the voice heard from a speaker doesn't remain a source of discomfort for very long, because their work simply won't let it. And the way that gap closes, gradually, through repetition and specific technique, turns out to be quietly instructive about how the brain handles unfamiliar versions of familiar things in general. Consider what happens to someone in the early days of voice training, the first weeks of working with a coach who insists on recording every exercise. At first, there's the same wince anyone feels, the same reflexive dislike of a voice that sounds thinner or nasal or strange in ways hard to name. But a voice teacher isn't interested in comfort so much as accuracy, and the recordings keep coming, lesson after lesson, week after week. What happens over that stretch of time is a form of recalibration, the auditory equivalent of what happens to someone who moves to a new city and, after enough months, stops noticing the accent of the people around them because the unfamiliar has simply become the ambient texture of daily life. The recorded voice doesn't change. What changes is the brain's relationship to it, the models it builds, the expectations it forms, the speed with which it stops treating this particular sound pattern as noteworthy at all. There's something worth pausing on here, which is that this recalibration seems to depend heavily on repeated, attentive exposure rather than mere passive listening.
A person could theoretically play back the same 10 seconds of their own recorded voice 1,000 times in a row, without much change in how strange it feels, if they were doing something else while it played, thinking about dinner, or half watching a television show in another room. What seems to matter more is active engagement, the kind of listening where attention is genuinely fixed on the sound itself, where a teacher or coach is asking specific questions about it. Is the pitch flat here? Is there tension in this phrase? Did the breath support hold through to the end of that line? This kind of listening recruits different resources than passive hearing does, and it appears to be what actually drives the sense of familiarity forward, session after session, until eventually, the recorded voice simply sounds like a voice, rather than like an uncanny imposter wearing a familiar name. Actors face a related but slightly different version of this problem, because their recorded voice often needs to be not just tolerated, but actively judged and adjusted for purposes of performance. An actor doing looping work, recording replacement dialogue in a studio long after filming has wrapped, has to listen to their own voice over and over on headphones, matching the rhythm and emotional shape of a performance given months earlier, sometimes under entirely different physical conditions. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal in its details, but broadly consistent with how the process has worked for decades, of actors in early sound cinema struggling badly with this exact task, because they had grown up entirely without recorded audio of themselves, and found the disjunction between memory and playback almost impossible to work around at first. Modern actors, by contrast, tend to have heard themselves on recordings since childhood, in home videos, in voicemail greetings, in the ordinary background noise of a life lived partly on camera and partly through a phone speaker. Their baseline tolerance for the recorded self is simply higher going in, before any professional training even begins. Broadcasters and radio hosts offer another angle on the same underlying process, because their relationship to recorded voice is often mediated by something called side tone, a term worth sitting with for a moment because it explains a very specific and very common piece of discomfort. When someone speaks into a microphone while wearing headphones, engineers can choose to feed a small amount of that live microphone signal back into the headphones in real time, so the speaker hears their own voice through the electronic chain even as they're producing it. This is side tone. Get the level wrong, make it too loud, or introduce even a slight delay, and the speaker begins to feel a strange, disorienting hesitation in their own speech, a phenomenon audio engineers sometimes just call delay-induced stutter, though it isn't a stutter in the clinical sense at all. It happens because the brain expects to hear itself speak within a very narrow window of time, something on the order of a few dozen milliseconds, and when the electronic path introduces even a slightly longer delay than that, the timing mismatch confuses the motor systems responsible for producing fluent speech. People who have experienced this describe it almost as if their mouth and their ears have stopped agreeing on what's happening, which in a very literal sense is exactly what has occurred. Properly calibrated side tone, by contrast, delivered with negligible delay at a comfortable volume, tends to feel almost invisible, simply part of the normal experience of speaking with headphones on. Broadcasters learn, often within their first weeks of professional work, to notice when the side tone in their headphones feels off, too hot, too quiet, slightly behind, because their fluency depends on it in a way that most people never have to think about. This is one of the more elegant demonstrations of how tightly bound speech production is to the timing of self-hearing, bone-conducted or otherwise. Take that feedback loop and disturb its timing even slightly, and something as automatic as talking suddenly requires conscious effort to sustain. Audio engineers themselves develop yet another form of expertise, one that has less to do with performing and more to do with listening critically, over and over, to voices captured through different microphones, in different rooms, at different distances. Part of what an experienced engineer learns to do is separate what belongs to the voice itself from what belongs to the recording chain, learning to hear a room's reflections as distinct from a speaker's natural resonance, learning to recognize the particular coloration a certain microphone imposes on low frequencies, the way a cheap laptop microphone might thin out a voice, while a well-placed studio condenser might round it out and add a warmth that wasn't quite audible in the room. This kind of trained listening lets an engineer make judgments a novice simply can't, distinguishing a technical artifact from an actual vocal quality, and it comes only from thousands of hours of comparative listening, moving back and forth between takes, between microphones, between rooms. Microphone technique itself plays a quiet but real role in how a recorded voice ends up sounding, something singers and broadcasters learn largely through trial and error, guided by more experienced colleagues. Standing too close to certain microphones exaggerates low frequencies through what's called proximity effect, giving a voice an artificially boomy, intimate quality that can sound wonderful for some styles and muddy for others. Standing too far away lets more of the room's own sound mix in with the direct voice, diluting clarity.
A singer who moves closer to the microphone on quiet passages and pulls back slightly during loud ones is performing a kind of physical mixing in real time, shaping how their own recorded voice will ultimately sound before it even reaches any electronic processing. Learning this skill requires listening back constantly, adjusting, listening again, gradually building an intuitive feel for the relationship between physical distance and resulting tone, until the microphone starts to feel less like an intimidating recording device and more like an extension of the voice itself, responsive to subtle shifts in position, the way a familiar instrument responds to subtle shifts in touch. What unites all these professional adaptations, despite their differences in vocabulary and equipment, is that they represent the very same recalibration ordinary people undergo more slowly and less deliberately when they simply hear enough recordings of their own voice over the years. The discomfort doesn't vanish because the recorded voice becomes objectively more pleasant. It vanishes because the brain, given enough attentive repetition, updates its internal model of what the self sounds like from the outside, folding that external version into the same broad category of self-recognition that once belonged only to the bone-conducted, internally heard voice. Professionals simply accelerate a process that, left to unfold on its own, tends to happen anyway, quietly, across the ordinary accumulation of years spent occasionally catching one's own voice on a message, a video, a recording, made almost by accident. There's a simple experiment almost anyone can try, and it tends to surprise people the first time, even though the physics behind it has been understood for well over a century. Plug your ears while speaking, pressing a fingertip gently into each ear canal, and your own voice suddenly sounds louder, closer, more resonant, almost as if you're speaking into a barrel. This happens because blocking the ear canal doesn't just muffle outside sound coming in. It also changes how sound generated inside your own head, through bone conduction, gets reflected and trapped. Normally, some of that internally conducted sound simply radiates outward and escapes through the open ear canal, lost to the room. Seal the canal, and that energy has nowhere to go. It bounces back toward the eardrum instead, amplifying the low frequencies in particular, since low frequencies are the ones bone conduction carries most efficiently in the first place. This is sometimes called the occlusion effect, and it's the same reason people who wear hearing aids or in-ear headphones often describe their own voice as sounding boomy or hollow while the devices are in, a genuine acoustic phenomenon rather than an imagined one, and a persistent annoyance that hearing aid designers have spent decades trying to engineer around, with only partial success. A related but distinct oddity shows up when people hear their voice over a telephone, and this one has more to do with bandwidth than with bone conduction. Traditional phone lines, for most of the 20th century, were deliberately limited to a narrow slice of the audible frequency range, roughly the band that carries the most information for understanding speech, while using the least amount of transmission capacity. That narrow band left out a good deal of the deep resonance and the high shimmer that a voice naturally carries, which is part of why phone calls have historically sounded thinner and tinnier than a voice heard in person. Combine that bandwidth limitation with the general strangeness of hearing a purely air-conducted version of your own voice, missing the internal bone-conducted layer entirely, and it's easy to see why so many people have grimaced at their own recorded voicemail greeting over the years, hearing something that felt both unfamiliar and somehow diminished. Modern digital calling has widened that frequency window considerably, and voices carried over newer systems tend to sound noticeably fuller and closer to how they sound in person, though the fundamental gap between bone-conducted and air-conducted self-hearing remains, no matter how good the transmission technology becomes. Whispering offers another small puzzle worth sitting with for a moment. When you whisper, you bypass the vocal folds almost entirely, shaping air into speech sounds using only the mouth, tongue, and breath, without the vibration that normally sends strong signals through bone and tissue. This means a whispered voice, heard by the whisperer, is unusually close to how it would sound to someone else, because so much of the usual internal bone-conducted contribution simply isn't present to begin with. Some people notice that their whispered voice feels less strange than their spoken voice when they hear a recording of it, and this appears to be at least partly explained by that missing internal layer, though it's worth being cautious here, since whispering also changes pitch, rhythm, and vocal effort in ways that could plausibly play a role too, and researchers haven't fully disentangled every contributing factor. Illness changes the voice in ways that are more obviously mechanical. A head cold swells the mucous membranes lining the nasal passages and throat, changing the size and shape of the resonating cavities that give a voice its particular color, which is why a stuffed-up voice sounds thicker, flatter, less nasal, in the technical sense, even though congestion is often described colloquially as sounding nasal. Laryngitis, an inflammation of the vocal folds themselves, can make the voice raspy, breathy, or reduce it to little more than a hoarse whisper, because swollen folds no longer meet and vibrate the way they do when healthy. None of this involves any deep mystery about self-perception. It's straightforward acoustics responding to straightforward physical change, though people recovering from illness sometimes report that their returning voice sounds unfamiliar for a day or two, a small echo of the same recalibration that happens with recordings, just compressed into a shorter time frame. Puberty offers a much larger and more permanent version of vocal change, and the underlying mechanism has been well understood
Since the early 20th century, when researchers first connected hormonal changes to laryngeal growth in detail.
Rising testosterone during adolescence, more pronounced in male development, but present to a lesser degree in female development as well, causes the larynx to grow and the vocal folds to lengthen and thicken. Longer, thicker folds vibrate more slowly, which produces a lower fundamental frequency, which is heard as a deeper voice. The dramatic voice cracks associated with this period happen because the growth doesn't proceed in perfectly smooth, coordinated fashion. The muscles controlling the vocal folds are, for a time, controlling an instrument that keeps changing size and mass out from under them, leading to unpredictable pitch jumps until the system stabilizes and the brain's motor control catches up with the new physical reality. Adults who went through a particularly awkward vocal adolescence sometimes recall being startled by their own changing voice on tape recordings from that period, hearing evidence of a transformation that felt gradual from the inside, but sounds, in retrospect, almost sudden. Aging brings its own set of vocal changes, generally slower and less dramatic than puberty, but still measurable. Vocal folds can lose some elasticity and muscle tone over the decades. Cartilage in the larynx may stiffen, and the respiratory muscles supporting breath control for speech often weaken somewhat, all of which can make an older voice sound breathier, sometimes higher in pitch for men as vocal folds lose mass, sometimes lower in pitch for women due to hormonal shifts after menopause. These changes happen slowly enough that most people never experience the kind of jarring surprise associated with hearing a first recording, since the internal self-model has time to update gradually alongside the physical change, a bit like how a person rarely notices their own face aging day to day, despite the cumulative change being obvious across old photographs. Accents raise a slightly different question, one about identity as much as acoustics. People who move to a new region or country sometimes report an odd sensation upon hearing themselves recorded years later, noticing that their accent has shifted more than they realized while it was happening. This reflects a well-documented linguistic phenomenon in which speech patterns gradually accommodate to the surrounding speech community, a process some linguists call accent convergence, happening below the threshold of conscious awareness. The internal self-model of one's own voice, including its accent, updates continuously and invisibly, so the shift feels imperceptible from the inside even as it accumulates into something quite noticeable from the outside, particularly to old friends or family who haven't been present for the gradual transition and who sometimes remark on it long before the person himself notices anything different. A more technical experiment, familiar to anyone who has stumbled into it accidentally on a poorly configured video call, involves auditory feedback delay. If a person hears their own voice played back to them with even a small delay, something in the range of a fraction of a second, speech tends to fall apart in a strange and specific way, becoming halting, stuttering, sometimes grinding, nearly to a stop. This phenomenon, sometimes called delayed auditory feedback, has been studied since at least the 1950s, when researchers first built machines specifically to introduce controlled delays into a speaker's headphones and watch what happened. The effect reveals just how tightly speech production depends on real-time auditory feedback, the brain constantly comparing what it intended to say against what it's actually hearing itself say,
adjusting on a time scale of milliseconds. Disrupt that feedback loop's timing even slightly, and the whole finely tuned system stumbles, offering a vivid demonstration that hearing one's own voice isn't a passive afterthought to speaking, but an active, continuous part of how speech gets produced in the first place. Deliberately altering pitch in real time produces related but distinct effects. Researchers have used software to shift a speaker's own voice up or down in pitch as they hear it fed back through headphones, and speakers tend to compensate almost instantly and involuntarily, adjusting their own vocal pitch in the opposite direction to correct for the perceived shift, even when told in advance that the pitch is being artificially altered, and even when they consciously try to resist adjusting. This automatic compensation happens too fast to be a deliberate choice, suggesting a kind of vocal reflex loop operating well below conscious control, constantly nudging the voice back toward some internally expected target based on what the ear reports hearing.
Certain neurological conditions offer a further layer to this picture, though here the science grows considerably more tentative, and researchers tend to speak in terms of case studies and hypotheses rather than settled conclusions. For most of human history, the only way to hear a voice was to be near the body making it, and this simple fact shaped how people understood their own sound for thousands of years without them ever needing to think about it as strange or contingent. Before any of this could be recorded, though, people were already shaping voices with architecture, long before anyone imagined capturing sound at all. Ancient theater designers in Greece built amphitheaters into hillsides with a precision that still surprises acoustic engineers today. Curved stone seating, arranged so that a performer's unamplified voice could carry to thousands of listeners, the shape of the space itself acting as a kind of passive amplifier. Cathedral builders in medieval Europe, working mostly by intuition and inherited craft knowledge rather than anything resembling modern acoustic theory, created stone vaults and domes that could hold a single sung note in the air for many seconds after the singer had stopped, the reverberation becoming almost a physical presence in the room. Speaking tubes, simple hollow pipes that carried a voice from one room to another, appeared in various forms across centuries, letting a voice travel through walls and floors while stripped of nearly everything except its most basic acoustic shape. In all of these cases, the voice was still tied to a living, breathing speaker somewhere in real time. It could be shaped, thrown, echoed, funneled, but it could not yet be kept. Once a person stopped speaking, the sound was simply gone, leaving no trace except in the memory of whoever had been listening. The idea of separating a voice from the moment of its speaking, of somehow trapping it and playing it back later, remained essentially unthinkable for most of that history, and then, rather suddenly, it wasn't. In 1857, a French inventor named Édouard Léon Scott de Martinville built a device called the phonautograph, which could trace the vibrations of sound onto smoked paper using a stylus attached to a diaphragm and a horn. It is worth sitting with how strange this achievement was at the time. The phonautograph could not play sound back. Scott de Martinville had no way to turn his tracings back into audible sound, and indeed, nobody would successfully do so until the early 21st century, when researchers used digital imaging and computer processing to convert some of his surviving phonautograms into playable audio more than a century after he made them. What he had built, without fully realizing its implications, was a way of making the invisible shape of a voice visible and permanent, even if he could not yet make it audible again.
It is a strange kind of first, a voice preserved before anyone knew how to unpreserve it. The breakthrough that actually let people hear a recorded voice again came about 20 years later, in 1877, when Thomas Edison built the phonograph, a machine that could both record sound onto a tinfoil cylinder and, crucially, play it back. Edison is often said to have first tested it by reciting the nursery rhyme about Mary having a little lamb, and by most accounts, he was as startled as anyone else in the room when the machine spoke the words back to him in his own recorded voice.
Before this moment, no human being in the history of the species had ever heard their own voice played back to them after the fact. Every person who had ever lived had only known their own voice through the internal pathway described earlier, the blend of air conduction and bone conduction that sounds fuller and lower than what a microphone hears. Suddenly, for the first time, a person could stand in a room and listen to a version of their own voice arriving purely through air conduction, the same thin, bright signal that everyone else had always heard, and for many early listeners, this must have been genuinely disorienting, a confrontation with a self they had never quite met. The years that followed the phonograph brought a rapid succession of technologies that each changed, in a different way, what it meant for a voice to exist somewhere other than the throat that made it. The telephone, developed in the same general period by Alexander Graham Bell, did something the phonograph did not. It let a voice travel across distance in something close to real time, compressed and filtered through wires and diaphragms, and later through amplifying circuits, so that a voice could arrive somewhere far away, sounding recognizably like itself, but also thinner and narrower, missing much of the low end that a body hears through its own bones. Early telephone conversations often required people to speak more loudly and more deliberately than they would in person, partly because the technology demanded it, and partly because listeners on the other end were working with a genuinely impoverished version of the original sound, a voice squeezed down into whatever narrow band of frequencies the equipment could carry. Radio, emerging in the early 20th century, extended this idea of the traveling voice even further, letting a single voice reach not just one distant listener, but potentially thousands or millions at once, all hearing the same compressed, transmitted version of someone speaking into a microphone in a studio somewhere. This created an entirely new kind of relationship between a person and their own recorded voice, because for the first time, a person's voice could become genuinely public in a way that outpaced their own physical presence, reaching rooms they would never enter and ears they would never see. Public figures of the early radio era, presidents and preachers and announcers, had to learn to speak in a new way for this new medium, a mode of talking that would translate well through a microphone and a limited frequency range, quite different from the projection needed to fill an amphitheater or the intimacy of speaking to someone across a table. Magnetic tape recording, developed and refined through the middle of the 20th century, changed the relationship again, this time by making recording and playback dramatically cheaper, more flexible, and more repeatable than the fragile wax cylinders and shellac discs that had come before. Tape could be recorded over, edited, by physically cutting and splicing the material, played back many times without wearing out nearly as quickly. This meant that ordinary people, not just inventors and broadcasters, began to have routine access to hearing their own recorded voices, on home tape recorders, in answering machine messages, in family recordings passed down through generations. The experience of cringing at one's own recorded voice, something many people describe as a small but persistent discomfort, likely became a widespread and common human experience only in this era, once recording technology moved out of specialized studios and into ordinary homes. The shift to digital audio in the later 20th century changed things again, in ways that were less about the sound itself and more about what could be done with it afterward. Digital recording represents sound as a sequence of numbers rather than as a continuous physical trace on tape or in wax. And once a voice exists as numbers, it becomes extraordinarily easy to copy without any loss of quality, to edit with precision down to fractions of a second, to store indefinitely, and eventually to transmit instantly across the entire world through the internet. A voice recorded once could now exist in countless identical copies, unchanged, no matter how many times it was played or shared, a kind of permanence that the smoked paper of the phonautograph or the tinfoil of Edison's first cylinder could never have offered. And this brings the story to something genuinely new, a technology whose implications researchers and ethicists are still actively working through, rather than having settled: voice cloning, in which machine learning systems are trained on samples of a person's recorded speech and can then generate entirely new sentences, words that person never actually said, in a voice convincingly close to their own. Where every previous technology in this history, from the speaking tube to digital audio, still required an actual voice to actually make an actual sound at some point in the chain, voice cloning breaks that requirement for the first time, generating new speech from patterns rather than from a living voice speaking in the moment. What this means for a person's relationship to the sound they leave behind, a sound that might now say things they never said, is a question this history has been quietly building toward all along. So let the story settle now, the way a held breath finally settles into an easy rhythm, and let us walk back through everything slowly, from the very beginning, to see how far the sound of a voice has traveled to reach this quiet room. It began, long before any of this technology existed, with a discomfort built directly into the architecture of the human head. Your own voice, heard from inside your own skull, has never been the sound other people hear. When you speak, the sound reaches your ears by two paths at once, not one. There is air conduction, the ordinary route, where sound waves leave your mouth, travel out into the room, bounce faintly off the walls and furniture, and arrive at your eardrums from the outside, the same way any other sound in the world arrives. But there is also bone conduction, a second and much older path in evolutionary terms, where the vibrations of your vocal folds travel directly through the bones and tissues of your skull, reaching your inner ear from the inside without ever leaving your body at all. Bone conducts low frequencies with unusual efficiency, so this internal path adds a warmth and a depth to your voice, a fullness in the lower register that the air-conducted path alone does not carry. Every person who has ever spoken has heard themselves through this double channel, this blend of outside and inside, and no one else in the history of the world has ever heard them quite that way. It is a private mix, assembled fresh in your own head every time you speak, and it cannot be shared, because it depends on the specific shape and density of your own bones. Everyone else, by contrast, has only ever heard you through air. Whether they are standing beside you or listening through a device, the sound that reaches them has traveled entirely through the air, missing that internal bone-conducted warmth completely. So there was already, Long before microphones existed, a fundamental and permanent gap between the voice you know from the inside and the voice the world has always known from the outside. This gap is not a flaw in any recording technology. It is a basic fact of anatomy, present in every human being, and it explains why recorded playback can feel so strange, even when the recording itself is perfectly accurate. The recording is not wrong. It simply confirms, honestly and without apology, the voice that was already there all along, stripped of the inside path you had grown so used to that you had stopped noticing it was even a separate contribution at all. Then came the long chain of devices built to capture and carry that outside voice, the version everyone else has always heard, starting with things that were mechanical rather than electrical. The speaking tube, little more than a hollow pipe carrying sound directly from one room to another, respected the physical wave of the voice without altering it very much, simply guiding it along a path air alone would not have taken. Later, Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville built the phonautograph, tracing the shape of sound waves onto smoked paper using a bristle connected to a diaphragm, though for years that device could only record a visual trace of sound and had no way to play it back at all, an invention that could see a voice but not yet speak it. Then Thomas Edison, working with tinfoil wrapped around a rotating cylinder, achieved something the phonautograph could not: a full physical loop, a way not only to capture the trace of a voice, but to reproduce it as sound again, and by most accounts, the first recorded playback anyone had heard, likely a fragment of Mary Had a Little Lamb, must have struck the small group of witnesses as something close to impossible. A voice, captured and returned, existing outside the moment it was spoken, was not yet part of anyone's ordinary experience of the world. From there, the recording chain kept adding steps between mouth and ear, each one useful, and each one introducing its own quiet distortions of frequency and timing. Microphones, in their many forms, needed to convert sound waves into an electrical signal, and every method of doing that, whether by carbon granules compressed and released by sound pressure, or by a diaphragm moving within a magnetic field, or by a thin condenser plate shifting in response to sound, responded a little differently to different frequencies, favoring some parts of the voice's range over others. Vinyl records etched sound into physical grooves, and in their early years, needed to compress the dynamic range of a voice to fit reliably into that groove. Magnetic tape carried its own characteristic hiss, and its own particular way of handling the loudest and softest moments of speech. Every one of these was a small act of translation, and every translation shifts something, even when the shift is too subtle to name precisely. Then, in the later 20th century, the shift to digital audio changed the story again, though this time the difference was less about the sound of a recording and more about what became possible once that recording existed. Digital audio represents sound not as a continuous physical trace, but as a long sequence of numbers, and numbers can be copied endlessly, without any loss of quality, edited with precision, down to fractions of a second, stored indefinitely, without decay, and sent instantly to any corner of the world. A voice that had once existed as one wax cylinder in one room could now exist as countless identical copies, unchanged no matter how many times it was played, a permanence the phonautograph smoked paper or Edison's tinfoil could never have offered. And that permanence brings the story to something newer still, something researchers and ethicists are only beginning to work through with real care: voice cloning, in which machine learning systems trained on samples of a person's recorded speech can generate entirely new sentences in a voice convincingly close to their own,
sentences that person never actually spoke. Every earlier technology in this history, however much it distorted or delayed or duplicated a voice, still required a real voice to make a real sound at some point in the chain. Voice cloning is the first to break that requirement, generating speech from a pattern rather than from a living voice in the moment. Which brings the story to prediction, and to why any of this ever felt confusing or unsettling in the first place. Your brain, hearing your own recorded voice, is not simply receiving a neutral signal and passing it along for calm evaluation. It is comparing what it hears against a lifetime of prediction, an internal model built from decades of hearing yourself speak through that private mixture of bone and air conduction. When a recording arrives without the bone-conducted warmth your brain has always expected, the mismatch registers, faintly but unmistakably, as something slightly wrong, even though nothing has actually gone wrong at all. This is not a flaw in your hearing, and it is not a flaw in the recording. It is simply two different, equally valid versions of the same voice, meeting for the first time, and your brain needing a little while to accept that both can be true at once. And identity sits quietly underneath all of this, the real reason any of it matters beyond mere curiosity about acoustics. A voice is one of the ways a person recognizes themselves, one of the threads connecting the self of this moment to the self of years before. And technology, ever since that first tinfoil recording played back a voice no longer present in the room, has been slowly renegotiating what a voice even is, how many forms it can take, and how much distance can grow between a person and the many recorded versions of themselves scattered across tapes and files and now vast training sets designed to imitate patterns of speech. But here is the steadier truth this long story keeps circling back to, gently, every time. Adaptation is real, and it happens quickly, more quickly than the first unsettled moment of hearing a recording ever suggests. Listen to your own recorded voice enough times, and the strangeness fades, not because the recording changes, but because your internal model updates, slowly folding this outside version of your voice into your sense of yourself, until it no longer feels foreign at all. The mismatch was never permanent. It was only new, and newness, given a little patient repetition, tends to soften into familiarity. So let this long unwinding of tubes and cylinders and tape and numbers come to rest now, the way it always does, back inside your own body, back to the one channel that has been with you the whole time and needs no device at all to reach you.
Notice your breathing, low and unhurried, moving in through your nose and settling somewhere deep and quiet in your chest, then releasing again without any effort on your part. This is a voice too, in its own way, wordless and steady, and you have always heard it entirely from the inside. No recording required, no gap between the version you know and the version anyone else could ever hear, because no one else was ever meant to hear this one. Let it carry you the rest of the way down, breath after breath after breath, needing nothing further from you now. Rest well.